never thought I'd have a reason to be afraid of the cafeteria. Sure, the food was always bad. The pizza was cold, the burgers looked gray, and the soup smelled like it had been around for weeks. But up until last week, I just thought it was gross, not dangerous. Until kids started disappearing. It started with Josh, a kid in my grade who was always causing trouble. He'd get into fights, pull pranks, and talk back to teachers. Everyone knew Josh by his loud laugh and the way he seemed to be everywhere. But then one day, he just wasn't there. I remember noticing his empty seat in math, but I didn't think much of it. Kids skip school all the time, right? Then a few days later, Emily was gone too. She was a quiet girl, kept to herself, but she had this habit of drawing on her desk in art class. We all used to see her doodles, little stick figures, smiley faces, sometimes even a weird animal. But one day her desk was just clean, like she'd never sat there. By the time 3 other kids went missing, people started to notice. There were rumors, of course. Some said they'd transferred, or maybe they were expelled. But it felt off. No one had seen them leave. No one had heard anything about them leaving, and their parents weren't talking. Our school's pretty small, so if something big happens, people usually know. The weirdest part, though, was the cafeteria food. It started tasting different. It wasn't that it got better or anything. Actually, it was worse, but in a strange way. The meat was tougher, almost like chewing rubber, and the smell was, well, it was bad. Real bad. But that wasn't the strangest part. One day, while I was picking at my lunch, I noticed something strange in my burger patty. It was small, tiny even, and looked like a fingernail. A human fingernail, embedded right in the center of the meat. I gagged and nearly threw my lunch tray right there. I didn't want to make a scene, so I just shoved the burger to the side, telling myself it had to be a mistake. Maybe it was plastic. That's what I wanted to believe anyway. The next day, I found a tiny button in my soup, like the kind you'd find on a kid's jacket. It was bright red and looked exactly like the one Emily used to wear. I tried to tell myself it couldn't be, but the doubt lingered. The cafeteria was serving something weird, and it wasn't just the food. After that, I started noticing other little things, like how the lunch lady, Mrs. Crenshaw, was watching us eat more carefully than before. She had this strange look on her face, almost like she was waiting for us to say something. She's always been kind of creepy, with her wrinkled face and stringy hair, but now she seemed different. She was always there, leaning over the counter, staring at us with that strange look. And whenever I looked at her, I felt like she knew something she didn't want me to know. I decided to skip lunch after that. I couldn't stomach it anymore, and the idea of finding something else in my food was enough to make me lose my appetite. But one day, my friend Aaron dared me to go back. "Come on, it's just a burger," he said, laughing. "It's not like they're putting actual people in there." I laughed too, even though I didn't find it funny. But I went along with it, mostly because I didn't want to look like a coward. So we grabbed our trays and sat down, and I forced myself to take a bite. It was just as bad as I remembered, but I managed to choke it down. Then, as I took another bite, I felt something sharp hit my teeth. I pulled the burger away and saw a small silver bracelet partially buried in the meat. It was tiny, the kind you'd see on a kid's wrist. I stared at it, unable to move. Aaron saw it too, and his face went pale. We both knew it looked familiar. I was sure I'd seen it on Josh before he disappeared. We sat in silence, both of us staring at the bracelet. Neither of us dared to speak, because we both knew what we were thinking, and neither of us wanted to say it out loud. That's when Mrs. Crenshaw's voice broke the silence. "Is something wrong, boys?" I looked up to see her standing over us, her face twisted in a strange sort of smile. Her eyes seemed darker than usual. She leaned in close, so close I could smell the sickly sweet scent of her perfume, mixed with something rotten. "No," I stammered, quickly shoving the bracelet into my pocket. "Nothing's wrong. The food's fine." She didn't move. She just stood there, watching me, and I could feel her gaze burning into me. Finally, she nodded, and her smile widened, showing too many teeth. "Good. It's nice to see kids enjoying their lunch." As she walked away, I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. Aaron looked at me, his face still pale. "We need to tell someone," he whispered. But I didn't know who would believe us. The teachers wouldn't listen. They'd just think we were causing trouble. And telling our parents seemed useless, considering they always thought we were exaggerating about school stuff. But I knew one thing. I couldn't ignore this anymore. Something was wrong in that cafeteria, and I needed to find out what it was, even if it scared me. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the cafeteria. I barely slept, my mind racing with questions about the kids who were missing and what I'd found in my food. The next morning, Aaron and I met up before school. We both knew we had to do something, but we weren't sure what. "So, what's the plan?" Aaron asked, keeping his voice low as we walked to class. I shrugged, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "I guess we need to find out where Mrs. Crenshaw keeps the food. Maybe there's a clue in the kitchen." Aaron looked at me like I was crazy, but he didn't argue. We both knew this was more than just a prank or coincidence. Something was going on, and it was big. After school, we snuck back in through the side doors. Most kids had gone home and the hallways were empty. We crept down to the cafeteria, listening for any signs of teachers or janitors. When we reached the doors to the kitchen, Aaron hesitated, his hand hovering over the handle. "You sure about this?" he whispered. I nodded. "Yeah, we need to know." We slipped inside, and the smell hit us immediately. It was even worse than in the cafeteria, thick and rotten, like old meat left out for too long. My stomach churned, but I pushed forward, moving past the counters and shelves full of canned goods. We were halfway through the kitchen when we heard footsteps. Aaron grabbed my arm, pulling me behind a large metal cabinet. We huddled together, trying to stay quiet as the footsteps got closer. Through a small gap, I saw Mrs. Crenshaw walk in, humming to herself. She was holding something in her hands, wrapped in a dirty cloth. We watched as she went over to the large industrial fridge in the corner. She opened it, and a blast of cold air and an even stronger smell filled the room. She quickly unwrapped the cloth, revealing what looked like an arm. A small, pale, human arm. I felt sick, but I forced myself to stay still, gripping Aaron's arm so hard he winced. Mrs. Crenshaw tossed the arm onto a tray inside the fridge and shut the door, muttering something under her breath. Then she turned and left, leaving us alone in the silence of the kitchen. As soon as the door clicked shut, Aaron and I let out shaky breaths. "We need to get out of here," he whispered, his face pale. But I shook my head. "No, we have to look in that fridge." He looked at me like I'd lost my mind, but I couldn't leave now. Not after seeing that. I had to know if it was really what I thought. Taking a deep breath, I walked over to the fridge and pulled open the door. The cold air hit me like a punch, but that wasn't the worst part. Inside were rows of trays, each holding parts. Pieces of what used to be kids, all lined up neatly like ingredients. I felt bile rise in my throat, but I forced myself to keep looking. Among the trays, I spotted a small, worn sneaker, the kind Josh used to wear, and a tiny hair clip that looked just like Emily's. Aaron was trembling, his face pale as he stared into the fridge. "We have to tell someone. This is sick." I nodded, but a part of me felt numb, like I was outside of my own body, just watching everything happen. I quickly closed the fridge, and we turned to leave. But just as we stepped away, the door to the kitchen swung open. Mrs. Crenshaw was standing there, her face twisted into a sneer. Well, I thought I heard rats in here." She moved toward us, her eyes narrowing. We backed up, but there was nowhere to go. She was blocking the only exit. My heart pounded as she reached into her apron, pulling out a long, shiny knife. "Now, boys," she said, her voice soft and almost gentle. "You shouldn't be snooping around in places you don't belong." I felt Aaron's hand tighten on my arm, and I knew we had to run. I grabbed a metal pan from a nearby shelf and hurled it at her. She dodged, but it gave us enough time to slip past her and sprint for the door. I could hear her footsteps pounding behind us as we raced down the hall, our shoes squeaking on the tile. We burst out the side doors and didn't stop running until we were far from the school. When we finally slowed down, both of us were gasping for breath, our hearts racing. Aaron looked at me, his face pale. "We have to tell someone. The police, the principal. Someone has to stop her." I nodded, my mind racing, but I knew that if we went to the police without proof, they'd think we were making it up. We needed evidence, something they couldn't ignore. The next day, we came up with a plan. We decided to sneak back in, but this time we'd bring a camera to take pictures. It was risky, but it was the only way to prove what was happening. We had to wait until after dark, when the school was empty, to make sure we wouldn't get caught. That night, we met up again and snuck back into the kitchen. My hands were shaking as I pulled out my phone and opened the camera. We crept over to the fridge, and I slowly pulled open the door, trying not to make any noise. The trays were still there, just as we'd seen before. I took a few pictures, my heart pounding with every click. Then, I reached for the tray with Josh's sneaker. As I lifted it, I felt a surge of anger and fear. We had to stop her. She couldn't keep doing this. Just then, we heard the door creak open behind us. I turned to see Mrs. Crenshaw standing there, her eyes dark and furious. "You just couldn't leave well enough alone, could you?" she hissed, stepping closer. I backed up, clutching the tray as if it could protect me. Aaron stood frozen, his eyes wide with fear. Mrs. Crenshaw took another step forward, her hands clenching into fists. But then, we heard a voice from behind her. It was Officer Daniels, the local police officer. He must have heard us sneaking around or seen the lights in the kitchen. He looked between us and Mrs. Crenshaw, his face full of confusion. "What's going on here?" he asked, taking in the scene. Mrs. Crenshaw's face paled, and she quickly tried to put on a friendly smile. "Oh, just a little kitchen mix-up. The boys got curious, that's all." But I didn't let her finish. I shoved the tray at Officer Daniels, showing him the sneaker and the other pieces. He stared at it, his face going pale as he realized what he was looking at. After that, everything happened fast. Mrs. Crenshaw tried to run, but Officer Daniels grabbed her, and soon more police arrived. They searched the kitchen and found everything: the fridge, the trays, and all the other horrible things she'd been hiding. Aaron and I watched from the hallway as they took her away in handcuffs, her face twisted in anger. She glared at us as they led her past, her eyes full of hatred. But I didn't care. I was just glad it was over. In the days that followed, the school was full of rumors. People were horrified when they found out what had been happening right under their noses. The cafeteria was shut down, and the police started an investigation. They found out that Mrs. Crenshaw had been working there for years, quietly getting rid of kids who caused trouble, or at least that's what she told the police, and somehow no one had ever noticed. I didn't want to think about it, but I knew I'd never forget what we saw in that kitchen. And even now, sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still see her face, twisted into that awful smile as she watched us eat.